Tolkien talk on fairy stories continued. Bam. Confirm and go live. Yo, what's up, man? How you been?
Good. Long day, but we're here. So
Yeah. Did you have an exciting day, or was it just kind of a usual normal day?
nah, I just watched my grandma. So it's just making sure she doesn't do anything dumb around the house. Go to McDonald's, pick us up lunch. That's really about it. Sit around and watch old TV shows. Um, Watched a lot of Gunsmoke, which is an old Wild West TV show, and the Andy Griffith Show on TV Land. We watched it a lot,
Well, it doesn't sound too
so that's
terrible.
pretty interesting. Well, that's not that bad. Gunsmoke is actually a really good show. The more I watch it, the more like, wow, this dialogue is like really clever and snappy, and like each episode's an hour long, and there's like 25 seasons with like 26 episodes in it, so they did a lot of shit.
Nice.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, if you guys were unaware, we're obviously here to talk about Tolkien again, and kind of pick up where we left off with on fairy stories, and we'll be concluding that today. So, yeah, dude. So last week we really covered Tolkien essentially arguing the merit of fairy stories and why they're important and why why people criticize them and how they're miscriticized for being for children and kind
Yep.
of this idea
Talk about
that
the soup.
yeah, he talked about the soup. He talked about how things like mythology, which is essentially fairy story, is put on like this higher kind of platform, and whereas fairy stories are kind of criticized and said they're for children. And today he kind of expands more on that and what we're going to be talking about. More on the merit of fairy stories, obviously. Yo, what's up, Atolia1024 in the chat? I got a new follower, Atolia1024. Like, I'll run the notification. Look, there's Aragorn. He's gonna look at you, and it says you're following. Cool beans. If you have any insights or questions or anything in the chat, you can always type that in there as well. But yeah, we'll kick it off right where we left off, right here in fantasy, and I will read this opening passage to you that Tolkien has to say, because he does argue that fantasy is an essential part of fairy stories. So he says the human mind is capable of forming mental images of things not actually present. The faculty of conceiving the images is or was naturally called imagination. But in recent times, in technical, not normal language, imagination has often been held to be something higher than the mere image making ascribed to the operations of fancy, a reduced and depreciatory form of the older word fantasy. An attempt is thus made to restrict, I should say misapply, imagination to the power of giving to ideal creations the inner consistency of reality. Again, he's addressing this kind of criticism in a way, right? Where we kind of say, well, fantasy, it's whatever, it's for children, it's not real. But then we look at things like imagination, and we're like, dude, it's great to have a good imagination, and he's really saying, well, people are kind of confusing the meanings of those words. Like fantasy and imagination aren't that far removed, but fantasy more encompasses what those people are referring to than imagination does. Is that what you get from
Also,
this?
imagination is and imagination is the enabler of fantasy as a whole. What was it he said last time we were discussing about this, about how the elements we assign man, like we assign the gods these divinity, and we're the ones that bring power to it.
Right.
So imagination is key to everything, especially for world building. Being able to generate your own world is just basically you're in your head all the time, thinking about your own little planet or your own little universe or your own magic system or what have you, whatever you're working on. For you, probably more music oriented. I'm pretty sure you run riffs through your head all the time when you're thinking about a new song or some such, just over and over again.
Right.
It's
Yeah.
a very important part of the brainstorming.
Yeah, and fantasy is the tool with which Tolkien builds fairy stories. Essentially, he utilizes things that are not found in our primary world, which encompasses what fantasy is, right? And he
Mm.
really he explicitly calls fantasy the highest form of art, which which I think is really cool. And he kind of he goes on and on about obviously things about the primary world and then being a secondary creator and creating a secondary world and why that's relevant and why that's important. And yeah, he's talking about obviously subcreation and all these kind of differences between imagination and fantasy. And that leads him
Mm.
to say fantasy in this sense is, I think, not a lower but a higher form of art, indeed the most nearly pure form, and so when achieved, the most potent. And he puts these little notes like that because he also criticizes people who kind of fail to achieve that, and he likes
Mm.
to talk about how fantasy gets maybe a bad name because so many people fail to do it correctly, and so many people who do it
Absolutely.
make a mockery of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I kind of I know a lot of like I don't like just know of a lot of indie authors that churn out like the dime novel, like the magazine stuff, the short story production. Unfortunately, especially back in the day of the sword and sorcery stuff, the pulp sword and sorcery was just like the generic Conan stuff. That really, especially in the early, late '80s, is when the super nerdiness got subscribed to D&D. Um, you know, and that would went along alongside those barbarian movies, all the sword and board and all the magic and all like the hot ladies and the bikini stuff. All that started with Conan, and unfortunately D&D got lumped into it along with the other fantasy. So I can understand his frustrations, but at the same time, like we shouldn't knock authors that are filling up dime store novellas. If they just enjoy writing short stories all the time.
Right.
It's there because the thing about fantasy, the good thing about fantasy authors, Orson Scott Card wrote about this on writing science fiction and fantasy. He said that they're always going to be consumers if you write fantasy. They're always there because there's always people that just want to read more fantasy. They want to read more science fiction. They want to have like something they can read when they're on the bus to their shitty job or what have you. It's their main form of escapism. Um, so, even if a lot of people do try their hand and they fail at it, or if they just make something more generic, eh, that's my 2 cents, at least for my impression.
Yeah. So Tolkien kind of goes on to say that because of the misrepresentation of fantasy, because of its strength, really, which is he calls it arresting strangeness, right? Where you're kind of caught
Mm,
in this world of disbelief in a way, or a world of things that are unusual to you. And he argues that that is the advantage of fantasy. But people kind of don't really like to feel arrested by things. They don't like to be in uncomfortable situations. They don't like to
mm,
feel stuck in a place that they're unfamiliar with. And when people do it wrong, that's how a lot of readers feel. And then they mistake fantasy with dreaming, which Tolkien asserts
mm.
is not good because there's no art in a dream, right? Whereas
Yeah.
fantasy is this artful, creative space. And he goes on to say, but the error or malice engendered by disquiet and consequent dislike is not the only cause of this confusion, the confusion of confusing fantasy and dreams. He says, fantasy is also an
Mm,
essential drawback. It is difficult to achieve. Fantasy may be, as I think, not less but more subcreative. But at any rate, it is found in practice that the inner consistency of reality is more difficult to produce. The more unlike are the images and the rearrangements of primary material to the actual arrangements of the primary world. It is easier to produce this kind of reality with more sober material. Fantasy, thus, too often, remains undeveloped. It is and has been used frivolously, or only half seriously, or merely for decoration. It remains merely fanciful. Anyone inheriting the fantastic device, a human language, can say the green sun. Many can then imagine or picture it. But that is not enough, though it may already be a more potent thing than many a thumbnail sketch or transcript of life that receives literary praise, right? So he throws in this jab at the end, obviously, at critics who give all this praise to random things that to him are more frivolous, right?
Yeah.
While also addressing why people give fantasy such a bad name, and it's because so many people misuse it. And the important part for me here is when he's talking about the consistency of reality, right? The inner consistency of reality. And if the world itself, the created world doesn't make sense, you'll lose a lot of readers, right? And that's an issue. I mean, we talk about Star Wars, you and I, we've talked about a number of nerdy things. You know, you can look at things like Game of Thrones or any real, fiction out there, right? If something doesn't make sense within the world and the world building isn't right, Harry Potter, whatever, everything else, then you're thrown out of the story. You call into question immediately the believability of anything within the world. We know it's not necessarily. We know wizards aren't real in our life, but as soon as the enchantment, as Tolkien would call it, is broken, you're lost, right?
Yeah, and he really does start breaking into world building here. There are all sorts of juicy morsels, like going on from what you just read. This passage, what I think he's essentially addressing here is that world building as the art. To make a secondary world inside which the green sun will be credible, commanding secondary belief, will probably require labor and thought, and will certainly demand a special skill, a kind of elvish craft. So, elves, angelic, you can replace them in, it's something that's divine, basically. The ability to be a good world builder is a almost divine-like skill. And then he goes, few attempt such difficult tasks, but when they are attempted and in any degree accomplished, then we have a rare achievement of art, indeed narrative art, story making in its primary and most potent mode. So again, world building, when you have someone who just has the imagination and he can keep it in balance with someone we get things like Star Wars. We can get something that is complete, like you were just talking about. It completely jumps over the uncanny valley. Like, it just makes that leap in a single jump, and we're good to go. And we never feel out of place in that universe ever. Lord of the Rings is very similar in that way. This is the guy that wrote that book. The ability to world build properly, and another guide to fantasy and science fiction writing I wrote. I didn't write it, but I read one time. The first thing the guy goes into is don't try to name all of your materials something special. A sword is a sword, right? A shield is a shield. An iron plate of armor is an iron plate of armor. The person's going to visualize that in their head. If you're going to say, oh, my culture doesn't use a sword, they use a drachma, and they don't wear plate armor, they wear a hoodoo, and they da-da-da-da, and it just blows off and off and off, and then you're caught in a mire or a bog.
Right.
Dungeon, I think, is how Tolkien addressed it in the opening paragraph. It's because world building, it's tricky. It really is.
Yeah. So Tolkien then kind of goes on to be very critical of critics, right? And this is a constant theme here, going back to the previous thing I read, and he says, in human art, fantasy is a thing best left to words, to true literature. All right, already off the bat, a little passive aggressive here, guys. Hey, you guys think this is literature? No. Fantasy is true literature, right? In painting, for instance, the visible presentation of the fantastic image is technically too easy. The hand tends to outrun the mind, even to overthrow it. Silliness or morbidity are frequent results. It is a misfortune that drama an art fundamentally distinct from literature, should so commonly be considered together with it, or as a branch of it, right? Okay, here we go. Hey, let's throw some shade at painting. Not because painting in itself is not a good art form, but it's not a true form of literature, right? Like painting is easy. You can draw a green sun as he mentions, right? But when you write about it,
Yep.
to make it make sense in the world, to convince you that it exists, your brain can picture it, right? But how do you make people believe it exists? For what reason, right? And so that's why Tolkien argues it's easy to draw it. It's harder to create a world where it makes sense. Throwing shade at drama, and he goes on about that as well. He says, among these misfortunes, we may reckon the depreciation of fantasy. For in part at least, this depreciation is due to the natural desire of critics to cry up the forms of literature or imagination that they themselves, innately or by training, prefer. And criticism, in a country that has produced so great a drama and possesses the works of William Shakespeare, tends to be far too dramatic. Drama is too dramatic, guys. First, he argues critics are either taught or they innately like drama better than fantasy, right? And Atolia in the chat says, I agree, fantasy is true literature if it's good fantasy. Very well put.
Yeah.
He's arguing critics, they're either trained or they just naturally like drama better than fantasy, and that's why they praise things like Shakespeare, people like Shakespeare, and decry people who create fantasy as people writing stories for children or whatever else, right? He goes on, but drama is naturally hostile to fantasy. Fantasy, even the simplest kind, hardly ever succeeds in drama when that is presented as it should be, visibly and audibly acted, right? Drama, Shakespeare wrote plays. He didn't write novelizations, right? Shakespeare wrote plays meant to be performed and acted, right? Whereas fantasy, and this makes me think that Tolkien would not have been a fan of The Lord of the Rings being adapted into films, even though maybe he couldn't have conceived of the technology we'd have today. But anyway, he says that they're meant to be visibly and audibly acted. Fantastic forms are not to be counterfeited. Men dressed up as talking animals may achieve buffoonery or mimicry, but they do not achieve fantasy. This is, I think, well illustrated by the failure of the bastard form pantomime. The nearest it is to dramatized fairy story, the worse it is. It is only tolerable when the plot and its fantasy are reduced to a mere vestigial framework for farce, and no belief of any kind in any part of the performance is required or expected of anybody. This is, of course, partly due to the fact that the producers of drama have to, or try to, work with mechanism to represent either fantasy or magic. I once saw a so-called children's pantomime, the straight story of Puss in Boots, with even the metamorphosis of the ogre into a mouse. Had this been mechanically successful, it would either have terrified the spectators or else have been just a turn of high-class conjuring. As it was, though done with some ingenuity of lighting, disbelief had not so much to be suspended as hung, drawn, and quartered. So, yeah.
He's just it's pretty clear on his face. Going back into what he was addressing about drama real quick, he is right. The drama play. We did the most basic production, Midsummer Night's Dream, in the 7th grade. My English class, we put it on, and I was helping as the assistant director to the teacher, and there were so many times in Shakespeare where it call, especially like the instance of the wall. It calls for Doggy's head. It calls for all these things that make up a part of it, and then they engross the audience in the show. It's just more immersive. And you're right. Whether or not he would like the movies, I don't know, because it seems to me he just really doesn't like costumes.
Well, I think he just doesn't.
A common theme here.
I think, had The Lord of the Rings been done as a play, you could argue, well, they couldn't achieve the things that they need to achieve to make it believable, right? But the films are framed as if it should be believable, right? They have to also strive for that inner consistency in the films. So maybe he wouldn't have had as much of a problem with them. But I think in general, Tolkien, we'll get into this later too, because he talks quite a bit about it in this essay. But he didn't really like progression. He didn't really like technology. He didn't like man-made things. He didn't like
Mm.
anything really. Like he likes nature. He likes you know he likes old things that aren't necessarily old, right? Um,
Mm.
Tolkien was not a fan of industrialization, and you can say maybe that had something to do with seeing bombs being dropped on people,
Yeah.
war.
He saw the first industrial mechanized war was World War I, and he went through it. And as far as we can tell, he saw combat. He was on the front lines. That changes any person that he sees. Also, for reinforcing your point on his love of nature, we need to look at like how does the Lord of the Rings get introduced? The opening sequences with hobbits. This may be because of Bilbo Baggins, but again, Bilbo Baggins was a central character in The Hobbit, and he was also a central character in Lord of the Rings. And the hobbits are so in tune with nature, even in some ways more so than the elves are, because they're so ancient, at least as they were described. They're
Right.
very peaceful, quiet folk, and he goes to a point to say that they have nothing more advanced than a bellows, and they don't want anything more advanced than bellows. That's just who they are. I think that speaks to a lot of what you're saying here, as him just not being a fan of. I don't think it's progress, but I think it's just industrialization. I think he's just He's very anti-industrialist.
Right.
He I don't think he has a problem with things like probably medication. The forward, more probably he might take an issue today with more forward-thinking progressives, but that he's not really a whole lot we could say on that because he's not here
Well,
to
that's
defend
that's the funny
defend his
thing
position.
is like people. I've seen arguments from people that Tolkien was this nationalist and like kind of like
No.
person. Like Tolkien, I think while he loved his country, he was the furthest thing from a nationalist. Like he argued how
Mm,
dangerous things like that were.
yeah.
And even in this essay, we'll get to that as well. In a brilliant piece of writing he
I
did.
think like I think he personally is probably. It seems he was very detached from the goings on of the world around him, especially after the onset of World War I. I don't remember him doing any major engagements. I'm sure he was involved in some way in World War II, like everybody was. If you were on the island, if you were living in London, you were involved.
Well, he
Like
fought in World
it's
War II,
just
I
how
believe,
it
as
was.
well.
Oh, I
Or
yeah,
he
I didn't read any
or he
of his
was
service record.
yeah, I believe he was a part of it. I don't know if he saw combat, but I'm pretty sure he was a part of World War II as well. Um,
Hmm.
but yeah, he
Because
go ahead. Sorry.
go ahead. No, just go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh well, I was just gonna go back to what he was saying about how drama obviously thrives through audible and visual performances. And
Mm,
he talks about he uses Macbeth as an example, right? And he says while reading Macbeth,
mm,
he finds the witches to be tolerable, but when he watches it as a play, like he can't stand it because it's really just a joke. It's a mimicry of
mm,
something. Like, nothing about it is believable, right? Whereas if you put that in a fictional, fantastic frame that makes sense, then it eludes what it's supposed to. It not eludes. Exudes or it provides you with this feeling of darkness and strangeness and uncomfortability because these witches could do anything at any moment, right? But when you're watching these people dressed up like witches, and obviously in Shakespearean times, those were men dressed as the witches, so it's even worse, right?
yep.
Um,
Yep.
and you really get a sense of Tolkien's just kind of distaste for literary critics and
Mm,
he doesn't argue at all. He doesn't argue at all that drama doesn't have a place, that drama isn't good. Obviously he talks
mm,
about great drama in his country which houses the works of William Shakespeare. He obviously reveres Shakespeare as well. Um Atolia in the chat says his son served in World War II, I believe. I don't know about that.
Mm.
It's possible, but Christopher
Oh, you mean
Tolkien,
if you were if you were a British citizen and
yeah, of
you
age,
were
then you were
involved in World
involved.
War II
Yeah,
in some way, you were involved. Like there was no question.
right.
um, you
Yeah.
know,
Uh,
for the whole how he ends it up with that Macbeth is indeed a work by a playwright who ought at least on this occasion to have written a story if he had the skill or patience for that art. Um, this is definitely. I think he just has a little disconnect from. The thing about Shakespeare is that it's that one thing that he hates. It's very symbolic. I think that Shakespeare had a very intended point when he was making Macbeth and what things were supposed to represent. And like, oh, look at these literary themes, and that's something Tolkien is opposed to. Is someone you taking a piece of creative fiction and saying, this is how it should be, no matter what. So I think there's probably just a disconnect there with him when it comes to appreciating some of these works, especially like Macbeth. It's
right.
just the dreariness of it. It's never supposed to go away. But I agree too. Like with Macbeth, another thing about the witches, and another thing he talked about is like the realm of dreams, and the witches have no rules. They just kind of pop up whenever. They serve as a device to push the plot along, and then that's their use. And they're
Right.
the only fairy part about it. It's not the most fantastical use, but I don't know. Maybe I just love Shakespeare a lot more than Tolkien. So far, I don't know. He's got some scalding.
Yeah.
Putting that heavy whiplash on.
Yeah. Yeah. Tolkien's really his point is that obviously he thinks that that critics overall misplace their faith in certain pieces of literature, right? And um, he argues that drama itself is not literature, right? Drama is not meant to be read as literature. Drama is meant to be watched, and
Yep.
so that there starts his issue with it. And then he goes on to say this, and to me, this is one of my favorite passages. He says, "To many, fantasy, this subcreative art which plays strange tricks with the world and all that is in it, combining nouns and redistributing adjectives, has seemed suspect, if not illegitimate. To some, it has seemed at least a childish folly, a thing only for peoples or for persons in their youth. As for its legitimacy, I will say no more than to quote a brief passage from a letter I once wrote to a man who described myth and fairy story as lies, though to do him justice, he was kind enough and confused enough to call fairy story making breathing a lie through silver." And I think that is a brilliant way to put it. He said he was kind enough and confused enough, right? This is pretty much saying like you're a happy idiot, right? Like you're a nice person who's kind of just not very smart sometimes. And obviously he's talking about C.S. Lewis here for you guys who don't know. And he pulls this excerpt obviously from Mythopoeia. He says, "Dear sir, although now long estranged, man is not wholly lost nor wholly changed. Disgraced he may be, yet he is not dethroned." Disgraced being D-I-S hyphen graced, as in not in the grace of God, right? Not under, not bestowed with God's grace, right? Or maybe you don't believe in God, right? Disgraced he may be, yet is not dethroned, and keep the rags of lordship once he owned. Man, subcreator, the refracted light, through whom is splintered from a single white, to many hues and endlessly combined, in living shapes that move from mind to mind. Though all the crannies of the world we filled with elves and goblins, though we dared to build gods in their homes out of gods in their houses out of dark and light, and sowed the seed of dragons, 'twas our right. Used or misused, that right has not decayed. We make still by the law in which we're made. Really,
Damn.
really, this is something brilliant, right? And if you guys have read Lord of the Rings, not necessarily watched it, but if you've read it, you understand that Saruman tries to embody this in a way. Saruman tries to throw off the light, his whiteness, right? Saruman the White is the head of the order of the White Council, the greatest lore master in all of Middle Earth, Saruman the White, this high almighty power, right? White is pure. White is the light of God, essentially, right? And
It's graceful.
yeah. And Saruman says, no, 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 I am not Saruman the White anymore. White gets dirty. White is it's not the color for me, right? He says, no, 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 I am Saruman of many colors, right? He wants to embody the refracted light, which Tolkien is arguing, right? When you have the light of God on you, right? This light, that's all of us. God created all of us, right? But when we then create as people, we're presenting something new, but it can only get the light it has from the original light, right? We create because we were created. We create as a result of being created, and what that means is it's the most inherent thing of our capabilities, right? Like that's what we know. We were made, so we make, right?
Yep.
And we're not creating things that don't exist and saying these are real and you should tell your children that things are real that aren't. I was gonna say something, but I don't. If there's children watching, I don't want to ruin Christmas for them. So um, he's even arguing that if you're disgraced, if you don't believe in God or you're not within the realm of God's light, you still have a right to create, right? And that won't go away. And it's not only our right, it's our obligation to create because we were created. I just think it's brilliant. Anyway, what say you,
It
Fred?
is. I mean, you kind of said it all, really. Uh, you know, world building is a very, like I've mentioned before, world building is a very difficult process, and the most difficult part of it is just the initial stages when you just, for better or for worse, when you're writing, all you're doing is sitting there by yourself and you're just thinking. That's it. You know, that's something, and you're creating this whole other universe that, as far as anyone else is concerned, is basically alive and true in your head. And it is divine in a way. You're creating a whole nother sub little something, whatever it is, and projecting all the light and all the dark from yourself into it, and that
Yeah,
light's always got to be there. But that's something that he addresses too at the ending, which is will always be my permanent takeaway. But just leading into the next passage after that one is just talking about fantasy is a natural human activity. It certainly does not destroy or even insult reason, and it does not either blunt the appetite for nor obscure the perception of scientific variety. On the contrary, the keener and cleaner is the reason, the better the fantasy it will make. If men were ever in a state in which they did not want to know or could not perceive truth, facts, or evidence, then fantasy would languish until they were cured. If they ever get into that state, it would not seem at all impossible. Fantasy will perish and become morbid delusion. So, what I feel like he's expressing here, especially with science, this is an important thing. Fantasy, people who specifically create fantasy, like one of my favorite author, my Brandon Sanderson. He finished the Wheel of Time series. He said one time he was approached at a signing event by a parent who said, "How do I get my daughter to stop reading this crap?" Basically, because she thought it was just like junk pulp fiction. But his books, like they're 1,300 pages long. He does a lot of really good, interesting world building. He creates these cool, like just unique places that you want to spend some time in, right? And you're like he was talking about earlier, the fantasy had been relegated to like a lower realm when in fact, or lower art when in fact it is a high or one of the highest arts. Um, I forgot what I was gonna say. That's something really good too. Uh, scientists, they use imagination to solve problems. That's all it is. They're in Fantasyland. They're doing it. They're world building. They're world building solutions to problems we have in real life.
right.
It's just a completely normal human process to sit here and spend time in Fantasyland in your own head, in your imagination. And like you said, the more you do it, the more hungry you are to understand the fantasy, the better the fantasy will be. And it's great,
Yeah.
divine, graceful.
Atolia in the chat said Sanderson is awesome! Exclamation point.
He
So,
is. He's a good guy.
uh,
Yeah.
yeah, and look at people who are like pure like secular people, uh, will argue obviously that like science is real and blah blah blah. And the thing is, right? Like I learned this interestingly enough in a critical thinking class where we talked about creationism and evolution, and essentially my point. I'll get back to like the specifics, but my point at the end of all this is that science and fantasy come about in the same ways, right? You're looking at real things and then you're trying to solve them in a way, right? That's what science is trying to do, and science appeals to you through logic and reason. And if you're to believe a well-written fantasy, they need to appeal to you through logic and reason, as well as emotion and other things, right? Things have to make sense consistently for you. And when we talked about creationism, there's no proof for it, right? So people think it's not real. And then they look at evolution. Well, evolution, look at all the science. Evolution is not proven. There's no proof. No one can prove it. If it was proven, it'd be the law of evolution. It's a theory that people came up with, but it makes sense. And because it makes logical sense to you, you believe it. Whereas creationism, some all powerful being created everything in the world, that doesn't make as much sense logically to you. But there's the same amount of evidence for both, right? Neither can be absolutely proven. And that's why there's an argument about it. Because if it was proven, sure, some people would still argue blah, 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 other blah, blah, blah. But if it could be proven, you'd have 95% of people saying, evolution is how we got to where we are today. Evolution is why life exists the way it exists today. But there's not actual proof for it. And that's what I'm trying to get at ultimately is both science and fantasy need to convince people through logic and reason that what's happening in that world is real. And when scientists come out today and tell you things, you believe it because it makes sense to you, even if it's not necessarily true. Because science is malleable. Look at nutrition science. Look at all these other sciences where eggs are terrible for you for years and years, and all of a sudden they're the best thing you can eat, right? Coffee, awful for you. Don't drink coffee. It's great now. Coffee is amazing. Wine is good for your heart. Oh no, wine kills people. Take a Tylenol a day or an aspirin a day because it'll prevent you from having a heart attack. Oh, now we found out after 30 years of research, it causes heart attack. Things change. Science changes. But as long as they tell you something that makes sense to your brain, you believe it. And it's the same principle with fantasy. Anyway, sorry for the long-winded diatribe about nothing. Back to Tolkien on fairy stories. The next passage I'm going to read is kind of just continue on. He says, fantasy can, of course, be carried to excess. It can be ill done. It can be put to evil uses. It may even delude the minds out of which it came. But of what human thing is this fallen world is that not true? Men have conceived not only of elves, but they have imagined gods and worshipped them, even worshipped those most deformed by their author's own evil. But they have made false gods out of other materials. Their nations, their banners, their monies, even their sciences and their social and economic theories have demanded human sacrifice. Abyssus non tollet usum. That's Latin for something sacrifice. Fantasy remains a human right. We make it in our measure, in our derivative mode, because we are made, and not only made, but made in the image and likeness of a maker, which a lot of people might get lost there, especially if they're not religious, but it's not what's important. Tolkien is just expressing his belief, and for anybody who says Tolkien is a nationalist, he explicitly tells you right here, obviously, that we put things in our real world to poor use at times. And fantasy... sorry. Yeah, fantasy is...
Good to go.
What happened? You good?
Good to go. Sorry.
Oh, okay, okay. Yeah, so fantasy is kind of like these criticisms of it, because it's been done wrong here and here, they define fantasy for critics. But it doesn't define your nation, right? It doesn't define your economic system. It doesn't define your money. It doesn't define your social programs. It doesn't define science when they're put to poor use, but it defines fantasy. And he argues that shouldn't be the case. Anything in our world can be put to poor use, but it shouldn't define it, right? And I think that's his argument, right? It's fantasy can be put to poor use. Fantasy can be taken to extremes, but that shouldn't be what the definition is. That shouldn't be how people view it, because everything can be done like that.
Yeah. And also the veneration of certain, like, just believing so vigorously in something when he was talking about believing something like a false god and making human sacrifices to it. False idols like monies, something you and I probably know a lot about today. A lot of people in this country are very materialistic to a point where it almost disturbs me sometimes. The hustle, as it's being called nowadays, is really just kind of a crapshoot, really. And you're doing it for something that may not end for, unless you're like, if you're doing it solely for your own benefit, it's not going to be satisfying for most people in the end. I know this is the truth because of the town I grew up in. There's a lot of people here who made it out big just for themselves, and they're still not happy.
Right.
So I really do feel that point on where you just don't worship things that really inherently will never be healthy for you. Basically, I think is an easier way to put that. If you worship money's never really going to do anything for you aside from what you've ascribed to it.
Right.
Worship things like good food, fertility. There's a reason fertility goddesses were so a good thing for a long time. We should worship good food, worship good drink. Worship real things, real tangible things.
Yeah, I mean, to quote Thorin Oakenshield, if more of us valued food and company or whatever he says, the world would be over money. The world would be a merrier place. He says over gold, obviously, but I'm paraphrasing. Okay, I don't have the line memorized, but
oh, good. That's a good quote.
Yeah, I mean, the cliche is money can't buy happiness, which is true. But if you're already happy, money can buy happierness.
Yes. Money can't buy happiness, but money can buy a boat, and a boat can make you fucking happy.
Right. Yeah. If you're already satisfied with where your life is at, yeah, money will make you happier, but it won't make you happy inherently.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So, we'll try to cover as much as we can because we have to end at 8:30 because of prior engagements. But we'll cover as much as we can in the next 19 or less minutes, 18 or less minutes. Okay.
Yep.
Moving on to the next section: recovery, escape, and consolation. I mean, this is the last section, so we probably can get through it. Tolkien opens up with this brilliant leaf metaphor. If you guys haven't read it, right? So. He talks about old age and how people kind of disregard it and say it makes you less powerful and it imposes these disabilities on you and he goes on to talk about leaves, right? Leaves exist. Leaves have always existed. And hey, if you see a leaf, man, you've seen leaves before, but every leaf is different, right? Every leaf is unique. And it doesn't matter how many trees you've seen. The first day of spring is still important. It's still a sight to behold, to see life, right? To see all of these brilliant things coming. And this is kind of his point, right? Like, I didn't really write any passages to read, but if you have one, you can read it. I guess one of them would be. He says, "Who can design a new leaf? The patterns from bud to unfolding and the colors from spring to autumn were all discovered by men long ago. But that is not true. The seed of the tree can be replanted in almost any soil, even in one so smoke-ridden as that of England. Spring is, of course, not really less beautiful because we have seen or heard of other like events. Like events never from world's beginning to world's end, the same event. Each leaf of oak and ash and thorn is a unique embodiment of the pattern, and for some this very year may be the embodiment, the first ever seen and recognized, though oaks have put forth leaves for countless generations of men." Right? And so
that's... Go ahead.
Well, I'm just saying, like, I think his argument is right. Like, people will say, like, fantasy often takes place in like years, like old ancient times and all this stuff. And people will say, well, you look at Lord of the Rings. It was written in the 40s and 50s or whatever. Like, how can that apply to today? Why it's old. Like, even books. I've read this book 100 times. Why would I ever read it again? There you go, Fat Rayo in the chat. If more of us valued food and cheer and song above hoarded gold, it would be a merrier world. Thank you, sir. I appreciate that. I should have had it memorized because, dude, I've read The Hobbit like 40 fucking times. And again, look at that, right? Why would I read it 40 times? The point is, no, this is why Tolkien hates allegories so much. If you read it once and you find out this is an allegory for the Bible, why ever read it again? You've solved it.
Read it again.
There's nothing more to get out of it. Right, but
it's like opening a puzzle box, and the puzzle's like you just pull out the puzzle that's already solved. It's like not in pieces.
Dude, I reread.
The only accomplishment is that you open the box.
I reread The Lord of the Rings every couple years, and I always get something new out of it. Always, right? And that's the brilliance of it. You can always apply old things to today and find new things to love about it. That's why I read Tolkien. That's why I love Lord of the Rings. That's why we're talking about on fucking fairy stories, guys.
Yeah. And to the fantasy as a whole, there's so much good fantasy out there that's made to be read. And like you said, with the leaves, if he was forming the oak, all the leaves that have come off now are just as beautiful and just as worthy of love and respect as that he's talking about. You need to cherish each and every unique instance of fantasy you get, because the idea that we're here now, being able to talk about this, and compared with the last 4,000 years of human history, is really special and unique. And so we should really take the time to enjoy it. That's just my 2 cents for that whole bit. Just picking up each leaf and just taking time to look it over and just enjoy the patterns, the unique pattern that was made just for you in that moment. And then you could cast it off. Someone else can pick up that leaf and they can see a whole different pattern. And that pattern is just beautiful and unique. Right.
And Tolkien talks about, obviously the big part of this discussion is the recovery aspect, right? And he's talking about, you can talk about all these fantastical things, but you also have to ground them, and you have to come back and you have to understand like where things begin and end, right? And then he talks about familiar things, and it's hard to make familiar things fantastic. He talks about how, something you can get something new, right? You can get anything new, and the longer you have it, eventually you just stop looking at it. You stop caring about it, right? And sometimes that's how fantasy is as well. He says, we say we know them. They have become like the things which once attracted us by their glitter or their color or their shape, and we laid hands on them and then locked them in our hoard, acquired them, and acquiring ceased to look at them. Hey, does that sound like a dragon to you? Does that sound like something a dragon might do? Yeah.
The ultimate incarnation of evil.
Right. So Tolkien goes on to say, of course, fairy stories are not the only means of recovery or prophylactic against loss. Humility is enough, and there is, especially for the humble, Morafolk, or Chestertonian fantasy. Morfolk is a fantastic word, but it could be seen written up in every town in this land. It is coffee room, viewed from the inside through a glass door, as it was seen by Dickens on a dark London day, and it was used by Chesterton to denote the queerness of things that have become trite when they are seen suddenly from a new angle. Right? Perspective is always important.
Perspective is always changing. It's just like you said, you read Lord of the Rings every couple of years, you always get something new because you have a different perspective. There are things in your life that have changed. He's right. It's like what Mary Kondo suggested. You should have 30. You should only have $30, and if you're not reading outside of those $30, you should throw them all away. You shouldn't have like shelf stalkers or something like that just to have behind you so you look important and smart.
Hey man, stop looking at my bookshelf and judging me, okay? I've read all those.
Well, are those like I can't tell if those like art books, or are they just graphic novels?
So I have graphic novels, obviously, Saga. I have trade paperbacks of Deadpool, Civil War, Inhumans, Batman, Obviously, I have my Baron and Luthien,
So see, this
Silmarillion,
is
Book of
it's
Lost
all stuff
Tales.
you enjoy. Like, is there anything in there that you would compare to your jewel of your dragon's hoard? Like, what is your prized book possession?
Well, I mean, probably the Silmarillion, like, or my encyclopedia, Star Wars encyclopedias.
Yep.
I have a whole Ultimate Marvel collection from Spider-Man, Ultimate Spider-Man. I have graded comic books
Yep.
in there as well. Yeah, man. I got a bunch of Star Wars books, so yeah,
Got a big hoard.
I got a big hoard.
Yeah. Just keeping in line with that, though, books should be actively enjoyed. And if, like you said, like I said earlier, you take you open the box, the puzzle's already solved. Woo!
Right.
That's it.
Yeah. So Tolkien talks about the Morfolk and blah blah blah, and he says that kind of fantasy most people would allow to be wholesome enough, and it can never lack for material, but it has, I think, only a limited power, for the reason that recovery of freshness of vision is its only virtue. The word Morfolk may cause you suddenly to realize that England is an utterly alien land, lost either in some remote past age glimpsed by history or in some strange dim future to be reached only by a time machine. To see the amazing oddity and interest of its inhabitants and their customs and feeding habits, but it cannot do more than that. Act as a time telescope focused on one spot. Creative fantasy, because it is mainly trying to do something else, make something new. May open your hoard and let all the locked things fly away like caged birds. The gems all turn into flowers or flames, and you will be warned that all you had or knew was dangerous and potent, not really effective chained, free and wild, no more yours than they were you. Gosh. Yeah, effective fantasy isn't just one thing. Effective fantasy isn't something that accomplishes one thing, and then Tolkien does this amazing thing with his words and shows you the enchantment and the spell that fantasy can put on you. I think it's just brilliant.
It is. He's a brilliant linguist. And you're right. Star Wars, again, something going back to that you and I talk about quite a bit. It's definitely more than one thing. It's not just one. It's not just one. It's not just, oh, we blew up the Death Star. That's the whole point of Star Wars, is to blow up the Death Star. That's it. No,
it's not just
that's not it at all.
stormtroopers or Nazis.
Yep, it's not just like Star Trek. It's not just this allegory for a perfect future. There's human story. There's still human struggles going on in Star Trek, and there's multiple things going on, and it's Tolkien said it best. I think is the only thing I can say on that. So, what other passage you want to move on
to? Okay, so we'll talk about escapism, right? This is probably longer conversation than we have time for, but we'll kick it off because it is important. People criticize fantasy for being escapism, and they say, hey, you shouldn't try to escape reality and blah blah blah, right? Like Tolkien has this to say. He says, "I have claimed that escape is one of the main functions of fairy stories, and since I do not disapprove of them, it is plain that I do not accept the tone of scorn or pity with which escape is now so often used, a tone for which the uses of the word outside literary criticism give no warrant at all, and what the misuses of escape are fond of calling real life. Escape is evidently, as a rule, very practical, and may even be heroic. In real life, it is difficult to blame it unless it fails. In criticism, it would seem to be the worse the better it succeeds. Evidently, we are faced by a misuse of words, and also by a confusion of thought." Again, Tolkien saying people are just using the wrong words and blah blah blah, right? Like, he was a linguist first and foremost, right?
Yep.
He says, why should a man be scorned if, finding himself in prison, he tries to get out and go home? Or if, when he cannot do so, he thinks and talks about other topics than jailers and prison walls? The world outside has not become less real because the prisoner cannot see it. In using escape in this way, the critics have chosen the wrong word, and what is more, they are confusing, not always by sincere error, the escape of the prisoner with the flight of the deserter. Just so a party spokesman might have labeled departure from the misery of the Führers or any other Reich and even criticism of it as treachery. In the same way, these critics, to make confusion worse, and so to bring into contempt their opponents, stick their label of scorn not only on to desertion, but on to real escape, and what are often its companions: disgust, anger, condemnation, and revolt. Okay, right? Critics are labeling things as escapism, therefore they're bad, and with
Mm.
that word comes disgust, anger, condemnation, and revolt. And he's comparing them.
Yeah.
He's saying, "Look, dude, hey, people in Nazi Germany wanted to escape their reality. Okay, like there are bad things in our real world happening every day, and why is it wrong for people to want to escape that?"
Don't want to take a break. Like it's the thing. Like he said, a miscommunication. It's not. It's not escaping. It's just taking some time for your damn self and going into Fantasyland with a sword and killing some fucking dragons or some shit. It's about going on this journey with Frodo as he's trying to get the magic ring back to Mount Doom so he can fucking huck it in there while he's being chased by this crazy, uh, fucking goblin. Not he's not a goblin because there's goblin stuff, but you know what I mean. Like just grotesque
Right.
humanoid thing that was once a hobbit, and he's like twisted by the ring and he goes, "Precious," and it's
Yeah.
just fun and it's exciting to read about, and you're rooting for Aragorn and all this stuff, and the Fellowship is broken. Now they're back together, and now they're broken again.
Yeah.
Fantasy as the idea of wanting to take a break from real life to me has always been the most important thing. And a lot of people deny themselves.
Right. Yeah, and bringing it
then
back,
people do it anyway. But yeah, go ahead.
bringing it back to what he was saying earlier, about the limitation of certain modes of fantasy that achieve only one thing, right? This is look, he's talking about escapism, right? And he mentions the Fuhrer and the Third Reich or whatever, right? And dude, yeah, that applied then, but guess what? It applies today too. Because there's a lot of bullshit happening in the world that we're trying to escape right now, and that's the brilliance of it, right? That's the brilliance of these things.
Especially now, we're all trapped at home. That's the thing. Is the thing. We're in quarantine. There's no better time to reread Lord of the Rings than right now, because we're both in counties that have been directly impacted by this pandemic. We're shut down, even outside dining for some reason. And it's all just kind of fucked right now. Basically, every time my dad listens to the news all the time, every time he turns on the news, the news anchor is basically just saying we're fucked, but like in a much more eloquent way that like strokes you down as you do it.
Right.
And so it's just nice to read a fantasy novel and have a good time. I'm taking care of my grandmother, who unfortunately, like, I'm not a primary caregiver, but I do help take care of her sometimes. And being there with her, watching her basically fall apart, like psychologically and mentally. It's not easy, and sometimes it's nice when I'm there, even though like 100% of my attention should be on her. Sometimes I just sit there and I read, and she watches TV, and that's the best we can do. She's escaping in her own way too. She's watching TV. She's taking in creative fiction. It's something we all need, and it's something and when we deprive ourselves of it, I think that the effects are disastrous. You just get a bunch of pent up angry people who basically have no dreams or hopes. Because when you kill dreams, you kill hope, and it's just
right.
You gotta have these things in these fantasy lands for people to run away from, and then they can blossom in this fantasy land, and they can come back as the person that's more, maybe a little bit more world wise because of the time they spend in that other world.
Well,
it's kind of stuff that other people always deny.
That's
the
also
hardcore literary guys.
That's also why some people are so religious, because having faith gives them hope, right? And it makes it like, dude, we had to, my fiance and I had to, she did most of the work obviously, but we put together a virtual memorial over the weekend that we held, and because a family member passed away recently, far too early, and so we've been dealing with that, dude, and like I've never, I grew up Catholic, but I haven't been religious, for 15, 20 years. I was never really religious, right? But when you're at services like that, and you hear pastors talking, and the things they're saying, like, you can definitely understand why people are. You can definitely get it. You can understand why Tolkien is so religious. Like, even the way he talks and everything else, it can convince you to be religious in a way, right? Like, some people just need that hope, and that small amount of hope that things are happening for a reason, and it means something. and that makes a big difference when you lose someone, right? So we'll come back
On that
to
note,
all this.
yeah,
Let's end with some hope,
we'll
guys.
wrap
We'll be
up
back.
next.
That's your hope.
Yeah. Yeah, we'll end up wrap up in log again with ending with hope is something that's really important, and we're definitely gonna beat that horse to death. I think next podcast. Unfortunately,
Right.
there were some time constraints today, but those won't be around next week. So hopefully we'll be all good.
Yeah, awesome. So thank you guys. Anybody new who's watching, if you want to follow, please do. If not, definitely understand. Thank you for watching and participating. Thank you, Fat Rayo, for commenting in the chat, and at Tolia as well. Thank you, Chair, for joining me once again. That's everything we have time for.
Always.
Thank you guys, and we'll be back in the future. Much love. Goodbye.
Goodbye.